Listen, friend. And I call you friend because you're here. Aren't you? Taking time to hear about something as mundane as parking meters and city ordinances. Tonight, we're diving into the story of how America's urban parking systems nearly collapsed because one meter maid refused to let a prominent businessman slide on a 25-cent violation. Where are you right now as you settle in for this tale? Maybe you're in your car, circling the same 3 blocks for the 4th time, watching that digital parking meter tick down while you frantically dig through your console for quarters that somehow multiplied into pennies and old gum when you weren't looking. Or perhaps you're walking past one of those sleek, new electronic meters, the kind that accepts credit cards and sends alerts to your phone, marveling at how something as simple as paying to park your car has become a technological marvel. If you're lucky enough to be somewhere with free parking treasure that moment, because by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly how precious and fragile that freedom really is. Picture America in 1971. Nixon was in the White House. The Apollo missions were still landing on the moon, and cities across the nation were grappling with the growing pains of post-war prosperity. More Americans owned cars than ever before. Suburban shopping malls were drawing customers away from downtown business districts, and municipal governments were desperately seeking new revenue sources to fund increasingly expensive urban infrastructure. Into this world of urban transformation and fiscal pressure came Dorothy Kowalski, a 42-year-old parking enforcement officer for the city of Millfield, Wisconsin, population 47,000, counting the students at the state university campus that dominated the city's eastern district. Dot had been writing parking tickets for 8 years, ever since her husband's factory job had been eliminated, and the family needed additional income to keep their mortgage payments current. Millfield was the kind of mid-sized American city that served as a regional hub for surrounding rural communities, home to the county courthouse, the regional hospital, 3 major banks, and enough retail establishments to keep farm families from making the 2-hour drive to Milwaukee for their shopping needs. The downtown district occupied 12 square blocks of 2-story brick buildings, constructed during the prosperous 1920s, when civic leaders had believed their community was destined for metropolitan status. But by 1971, downtown Millfield was struggling. The new Northgate Shopping Center, built on 40 acres of former farmland 3 miles from the city center, offered free parking, climate control, and national chain stores that could undercut local merchants on both price and selection. Main Street businesses were closing at an alarming rate, leaving behind empty storefronts and delinquent property tax accounts that strained the city's budget. The municipal parking meter system had been installed in 1962 as part of a comprehensive downtown revitalization plan. City leaders had argued that metered parking would encourage turnover, ensuring that prime spaces remained available for shoppers rather than being occupied all day by downtown employees. The meters generated modest revenue, about $40,000 annually. But more importantly, they represented the city's commitment to managing its urban resources scientifically and efficiently. Kowalski patrolled her assigned 6-block territory with mechanical precision, checking each meter systematically and issuing citations for violations with the impartial accuracy of a Swiss timepiece. She walked roughly 8 miles per day, examining approximately 800 parking meters twice during her 8-hour shift, and maintained citation accuracy rates that consistently exceeded departmental standards. What made Dot special, and what would soon make her famous in ways she never imagined, was her absolute, unwavering commitment to equal enforcement. Rich or poor, local or visitor, city council member, or unemployed factory worker, everyone received the same treatment under Dot's jurisdiction. If your meter had expired, you received a citation. No exceptions, no warnings, no consideration for status or circumstances. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning in March 1971, when Harrison Blackwood III, who owned the largest furniture store in 3 counties and served as president of the Millfield Chamber of Commerce, parked his cream-colored Cadillac Eldorado in a prime spot directly in front of the First National Bank, and inserted exactly 1/4 into the meter, enough time for what he assumed would be a brief meeting with the bank president about a commercial loan expansion. Harrison was the kind of man who commanded attention simply by entering a room 6 feet 2 inches tall, silver-haired, dressed in suits that cost more than most Millfield residents earned in a month, and possessed of the casual confidence that comes from 3 generations of business success and civic leadership. His great-grandfather had founded Blackwood Furniture in 1889. His grandfather had served 2 terms as mayor during the 1930s, and his father had been instrumental in establishing the state university campus that now provided much of the city's economic stability. The meeting at the bank, however, lasted longer than anticipated. What Harrison had expected to be a routine discussion about expanding his store's credit line turned into a comprehensive review of his business operations, financial projections, and collateral arrangements. By the time the bank president was satisfied with the documentation, nearly 2 hours had elapsed when Harrison emerged from the bank and approached his Cadillac. He found Dot Kowalski standing beside it, writing a parking citation with her characteristic, methodical precision. "Excuse me," Harrison said, using the tone of voice that had proven effective in countless business negotiations. "I think there might be some mistake. I'm Harrison Blackwood. I own Blackwood Furniture down the street. I was just inside the bank on business, and I'm sure we can work this out without any paperwork." Dot looked up from her citation book, glanced at Harrison's expensive suit and confident expression, then resumed writing with the same steady precision she had maintained for 8 years of parking enforcement. "Mr. Blackwood," she said without looking up again, "your meter expired 1 hour and 23 minutes ago. The fine is 25 cents, payable at City Hall within 10 days. Now, you might wonder why 25 cents should matter to a man who drove a Cadillac and owned the largest furniture store in the region. But in 1971, in Millfield, Wisconsin, the issue wasn't really about money. It was about respect, recognition, and the unspoken understanding that certain people deserved certain considerations. Harrison had grown up in a world where his family name opened doors, where bank presidents called him by his first name, where city officials consulted him before making major decisions affecting downtown business districts. The idea that a municipal employee would treat him exactly the same as any other citizen was not just unexpected. It was incomprehensible. "Look, officer," Harrison paused, realizing he didn't know Dot's name despite having seen her patrolling downtown for years. "I'm sure you understand that I contribute significantly to this community. I employ 47 people. I serve on the Chamber of Commerce, and I'm currently working with the City Council on downtown revitalization plans. Surely we can use some common sense here." Dot finished writing the citation, tore it from her pad, and tucked it under the Cadillac's windshield wiper with the same efficient motion she had perfected through thousands of similar transactions. "Mr. Blackwood, the parking ordinance doesn't include exceptions for business owners or civic leaders. Your meter expired, and city policy requires me to issue a citation. If you believe there are extenuating circumstances, you can contest the ticket at the monthly parking violations hearing. What happened next would be remembered in Millfield for decades to come." Harrison Blackwood, accustomed to deference and accommodation, found himself facing a city employee who seemed completely unimpressed by his status, his contributions to the community, or his obvious expectation of special treatment. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Harrison demanded, his voice carrying across the downtown street and attracting attention from passersby. "I could have your job terminated with one phone call to the mayor. I've been supporting this city for 20 years, and I don't appreciate being harassed by some overzealous meter maid who doesn't understand how things work around here." This was the moment that changed everything. A lesser parking enforcement officer might have yielded to Harrison's pressure, voided the citation, and avoided the confrontation. The parking violations manual actually provided supervisors with discretion to cancel tickets in cases of unusual circumstances or community relations concerns. But Kowalski had not spent 8 years walking the streets of Millfield to compromise her professional standards for anyone's convenience, regardless of their economic status or political connections. "Mr. Blackwood, threatening my employment won't change the fact that your parking meter violation occurred according to city ordinance. If you have complaints about parking enforcement policies, you should address them through proper channels with city administration. The confrontation was witnessed by approximately 30 people, including several downtown business owners, bank customers, and university students who happened to be passing by. In a city the size of Millfield, news traveled fast, and by lunchtime, the story of Harrison Blackwood's parking ticket dispute had reached every coffee shop, barber shop, and office building in the downtown district. Public reaction was immediate and polarized. Business owners and civic leaders generally supported Harrison, arguing that someone of his stature and community contributions deserved consideration for minor infractions. Working-class residents and university students largely sided with Dot, maintaining that parking rules should apply equally to everyone regardless of wealth or status. The Millfield Daily Register, the city's only newspaper, covered the incident on its front page under the headline, "Downtown Parking Dispute Raises Questions About Equal Treatment." The article was carefully balanced, but it included quotes from witnesses that made Harrison's behavior appear petulant and entitled, while portraying Dot as professional and principled. "I watched the whole thing," said Martha Henderson, a bank customer who had witnessed the confrontation. Mr. Blackwood acted like he was too important to follow the same rules as everyone else. The parking officer was just doing her job, but Robert Chen, who owned a men's clothing store 2 blocks from the incident, offered a different perspective. "Harry Blackwood has done more for this downtown than any 10 other people combined. A little flexibility on parking enforcement seems like a small courtesy to show someone who's contributed so much to the community." The newspaper coverage transformed a local parking dispute into a broader debate about fairness, privilege, and municipal governance. Letters to the editor poured in from both sides, with residents expressing strong opinions about whether civic contributions should influence law enforcement, and whether public employees should exercise discretion when dealing with prominent citizens. What nobody anticipated was that the publicity would inspire similar confrontations throughout the region. Within 2 weeks of the Millfield incident, newspapers in Madison, La Crosse, and Green Bay were reporting their own versions of the parking ticket controversy. As business leaders in those cities began challenging citations and demanding special treatment from enforcement officers, the phenomenon spread beyond Wisconsin as news services picked up the story and distributed it nationally. The Associated Press ran a feature article about the Great Parking Meter Rebellion that described a growing movement of prominent citizens who were refusing to accept parking citations and demanding recognition of their community contributions. Cities across the Midwest began reporting similar incidents as business leaders, politicians, and civic leaders challenged parking enforcement officers and demanded special consideration for their violations. Some municipal governments, concerned about alienating influential citizens, began instructing their parking enforcement staff to exercise more discretion. when dealing with prominent community members. But other cities saw the trend as a threat to equal justice and began taking steps to protect their enforcement officers from political pressure. The International Association of Parking Enforcement Officers issued a statement supporting uniform application of parking regulations, regardless of the violator's social or economic status. The crisis reached a turning point when Mayor Patricia Williams of Millfield announced that she was convening a blue ribbon committee to review the city's parking enforcement policies and make recommendations for balancing community relations, concerns with the need for consistent law enforcement. The committee, which included Harrison Blackwood as the representative of the business community, met weekly for 2 months and heard testimony from parking enforcement officers, downtown merchants, legal experts, and ordinary citizens. The sessions, which were open to the public, attracted standing room-only crowds and provided a forum for the broader community debate that had been triggered by the original incident. Kowalski's testimony to the committee was a masterpiece of principled public service. She explained her approach to parking enforcement, described the pressures she faced from various interest groups, and articulated a philosophy of municipal service that transcended the specific issue of parking violations. My job is to enforce parking ordinances fairly and consistently, told the committee. If I start making exceptions for people based on their wealth, status, or political connections, then I'm not enforcing the law. I'm administering a system of privilege. That's not what equal justice means, and it's not what public service should be about. When Harrison Blackwood presented his case to the committee, he focused on the economic contributions that business leaders made to the community and argued that some recognition of those contributions was appropriate in minor law enforcement matters. Nobody's asking for immunity from parking laws, Harrison argued. But surely there's room for common sense and community relations in how these ordinances are applied. When someone has invested their life in building businesses and supporting civic institutions, a little flexibility on minor infractions seems reasonable. The committee's final report, issued in September 1971, represented a carefully crafted compromise that satisfied neither side completely, but established principles that would influence municipal governance for decades to come. The report recommended maintaining uniform enforcement of parking ordinances while creating formal appeal processes that could consider exceptional circumstances on a case-by-case basis. More significantly, the report established the principle that public employees should be protected from retaliation when they refused to provide special treatment to influential citizens. The committee recommended policies that would prevent elected officials or business leaders from pressuring enforcement officers to compromise their professional standards. The Millfield principles, as they came to be known, were adopted by dozens of cities throughout the Midwest and eventually influenced municipal governance practices across the country. The principles established that equal treatment under municipal ordinances was a fundamental component of democratic governance, regardless of the social or economic status of the citizens involved. For Kowalski, the resolution of the parking meter rebellion brought both vindication and new challenges. She was promoted to supervisor of parking enforcement and became a sought-after speaker at conferences on municipal law enforcement and public administration. Her principled stand had inspired parking enforcement officers across the country to resist political pressure and maintain professional standards. Harrison Blackwood's experience with the parking meter rebellion had a more complex impact on his worldview and community standing. The negative publicity surrounding his confrontation with Dot had damaged his reputation and forced him to confront his assumptions about privilege and special treatment. In later years, Harrison would credit the incident with teaching him important lessons about civic responsibility and equal treatment. He became a supporter of municipal reforms that emphasized transparency and accountability in city government, and he developed a reputation for treating city employees with greater respect and professionalism. The parking meter rebellion ultimately demonstrated how seemingly minor disputes over municipal services could expose fundamental tensions about equality, privilege, and democratic governance. Kowalski's refusal to compromise her professional standards for Harrison Blackwood's convenience had triggered a national conversation about the principles that should guide public service in a democratic society. The 25 cents that started it all was eventually paid by Harrison Blackwood, along with a public apology to Kowalski for his inappropriate behavior during their confrontation. But the real value of that parking violation was not monetary. It was the reminder that democracy requires institutions and individuals willing to uphold equal treatment under the law, even when it would be easier to accommodate the preferences of the powerful. Today, Millfield's downtown district has been revitalized through a combination of historic preservation, university expansion, and carefully managed development that includes both metered parking and public transportation alternatives. The Parking Enforcement Office displays a plaque commemorating the 1971 rebellion, with a quote from Kowalski. Public service means serving the public interest, not private privilege. Story of the Great Parking Meter Rebellion reminds us that in a democracy, even the humblest public employee can play a crucial role in preserving the principles of equal justice and fair treatment that make freedom possible. Sometimes, the most important battles for democratic values are fought not in Congress or the Supreme Court, but on ordinary street corners where ordinary people make extraordinary choices about whether to uphold their principles or compromise them for convenience. But the true magnitude of the parking meter rebellion's impact only became clear in the years and decades that followed the initial confrontation. Like ripples spreading across a pond, the principles established in Millfield continued to influence municipal governance, professional standards, and democratic practices long after the original dispute had been resolved. The immediate aftermath of the rebellion saw dramatic changes in how cities across America approached parking enforcement and municipal law enforcement more broadly. The International Association of Parking Enforcement Officers, energized by the national attention the Millfield incident had generated, began developing comprehensive training programs that emphasized equal treatment, professional integrity, and resistance to political pressure. These training programs, known as the Kowalski protocols, in honor of Dot's principled stand, were adopted by more than 200 cities within 5 years of their introduction. The protocols established standardized procedures for handling attempts at preferential treatment, created documentation requirements for unusual circumstances, and provided legal support for enforcement officers who faced retaliation for maintaining professional standards. Dr. Samuel Richardson, a political scientist at the University of Wisconsin who had studied the rebellion extensively, published a landmark 1976 paper titled Street Level Democracy: How Municipal Law Enforcement Shapes Civic Equality. The paper argued that seemingly minor interactions between citizens and government employees had profound implications for democratic legitimacy and social cohesion. When Kowalski refused to give Harrison Blackwood special treatment, Richardson wrote, she was not just enforcing a parking ordinance. She was defending the principle that democratic societies must treat all citizens equally under the law. The rebellion demonstrated how individual acts of professional integrity can strengthen or undermine the foundations of democratic governance. Richardson's research revealed that cities which had adopted the Kowalski protocols experienced measurable improvements in citizen satisfaction with municipal services, reduced complaints about favoritism and corruption, and higher levels of public trust in local government. The data suggested that consistent enforcement of municipal ordinances, regardless of the violator's status, actually improved community relations rather than harming them. The rebellion's influence extended far beyond parking enforcement into other areas of municipal service delivery. Police departments began incorporating the Kowalski principles into their training programs, emphasizing that equal treatment under the law applied to traffic violations, noise complaints, and other minor infractions that often involved prominent citizens. Fire departments adopted similar approaches to code enforcement, refusing to provide special consideration to influential property owners who violated safety regulations. Building inspection departments implemented protocols that prevented political leaders from pressuring inspectors to overlook violations in properties owned by major campaign contributors. The cumulative effect of these changes was to create a culture of professional integrity throughout municipal government that made it increasingly difficult for wealthy or influential citizens to circumvent ordinary legal and regulatory requirements. This transformation was not without controversy, as some business leaders and political figures complained that rigid enforcement was damaging community relations and economic development. But supporters of the new approach argued that equal treatment actually strengthened business confidence and economic development by creating predictable, transparent regulatory environments where success depended on merit rather than connections. The Millfield model of municipal governance became a selling point for communities seeking to attract businesses that valued consistency and fairness over special deals and preferential treatment. The rebellion also had significant implications for women's roles in public service and law enforcement. Kowalski's success in resisting pressure from male political and business leaders inspired other women in similar positions to assert their professional authority and demand respect for their expertise. The National Association of Women in Law Enforcement, founded in 1972, explicitly cited the parking meter rebellion as a catalyst for their organization. The association's founding charter stated that the example of Dorothy Kowalski demonstrates that professional competence and integrity can overcome gender-based discrimination and demands for deference to male authority. By 1975, the number of women serving in parking enforcement positions had increased by 340% nationwide, with many citing Dot's example as inspiration for entering the field. More significantly, promotion rates for women in municipal law enforcement improved dramatically as departments adopted merit-based evaluation systems that emphasized professional standards over political considerations. Margaret Thompson, who became the first female police chief in Milwaukee in 1978, credited the parking meter rebellion with changing expectations about women's roles in law enforcement. Kowalski showed that women could maintain professional standards under pressure and command respect through competence rather than accommodation. Thompson said in a 1979 interview, "Her example made it possible for women like me to advance in law enforcement by demonstrating that we wouldn't compromise our principles for anyone's convenience." The legal profession also drew lessons from the parking meter rebellion, particularly as attorneys and judges faced increasing pressure to modify their decisions based on political or economic considerations. The American Bar Association's 1974 update to its professional ethics guidelines included specific references to the Millfield incident as an example of how professional standards could protect institutional integrity. Chief Justice Warren Burger, writing in a 1975 Supreme Court opinion that addressed judicial independence, specifically mentioned the parking meter rebellion. Just as the parking enforcement officer in Millfield refused to compromise professional standards for political convenience, judges must resist pressure to modify their decisions based on the status or influence of the parties involved. Professional integrity, in both contexts, serves the broader public interest by maintaining institutional credibility and equal treatment under law. This judicial interpretation of the rebellion's principles became particularly significant during the 1970s, as Watergate-era investigations revealed extensive corruption in local and state governments. Federal prosecutors frequently cited the Kowalski principles when explaining why they were pursuing charges against prominent political figures who had assumed their status would protect them from legal consequences. The rebellion's influence on academic thinking about public administration and democratic governance was equally profound. Universities across the country began incorporating case studies of the Millfield incident into their public policy and public administration curricula. Using the confrontation between Dot and Harrison to explore fundamental questions about authority, legitimacy, and equal treatment in democratic societies. Professor Janet Chen, no relation to any of the Chens in our previous stories, of the Harvard Kennedy School, developed what became known as the Millfield simulation, an interactive exercise where students role-played various participants in the parking meter rebellion to understand the complex pressures and motivations that shaped the crisis. The rebellion provides an ideal laboratory for examining how individual decisions can have institutional and societal consequences. Professor Chen explained in a 1978 article, "Students learn that professional integrity isn't just about personal virtue. It's about maintaining the institutional foundations that make democratic governance possible." The simulation revealed aspects of the rebellion that had been invisible in traditional historical accounts. When students played the role of Harrison Blackwood, they often discovered that his behavior, while ultimately inappropriate, had been motivated by genuine frustration with what he perceived as inflexible bureaucracy that was harming downtown business development. When they played Dot Kowalski, students experienced the intense pressure she had faced to compromise her professional standards for community relations purposes. Many reported that the simulation helped them understand how difficult it could be to maintain principled positions when facing personal and professional costs. These insights contributed to a more nuanced understanding of the rebellion that recognized the human complexity of all its participants. The crisis was not simply a story of good versus evil, but rather a complex interaction of competing values, institutional pressures, and individual choices that had produced unexpected consequences. The international impact of the parking meter rebellion became apparent as researchers began to examine similar conflicts in other countries during the same period. Municipal governments in Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and several European nations had experienced their own versions of the Millfield confrontation. As professional public servants resisted pressure from local elites, while traditional power structures struggled to adapt to changing expectations about equal treatment and institutional accountability. A 1980 comparative study published by the International City Management Association identified more than 60 separate incidents between 1970 and 1978 where municipal employees in different countries had faced political pressure similar to what Kowalski had experienced. The study's authors argued that these conflicts reflected a global transformation in the relationship between professional expertise and political authority. The Millfield incident was not an isolated American phenomenon, the study concluded. It was part of a worldwide shift toward professional autonomy and institutional independence that challenged traditional patterns of elite control over public services. The international comparison revealed that the principles established during the parking meter rebellion had universal applicability, transcending specific national or cultural contexts. Public servants in very different societies had found inspiration in Kowalski's example and had successfully adapted her approach to their own circumstances. The technological evolution of parking enforcement systems during the 1980s and 1990s provided another lens for understanding the rebellion's continuing significance. As mechanical parking meters gave way to electronic systems and eventually to digital payment platforms, the specific details of Dott's confrontation with Harrison might have seemed obsolete, but the underlying principles proved remarkably adaptable to new circumstances. Modern parking enforcement officers dealing with digital payment disputes, handicapped parking violations, or electric vehicle charging station conflicts could draw on the same principles that had guided Dott's decisions in 1971. The technology had changed, but the fundamental questions about equal treatment and professional autonomy remained the same. The emergence of automated parking enforcement systems, cameras that could issue tickets without human intervention, created new challenges for applying the Kowalski principles. How could automated systems incorporate the kind of professional judgment that had made Dott's approach so effective? How could they balance consistency with the flexibility needed to address genuine exceptional circumstances? These questions led to the development of smart parking enforcement systems that combined automated detection with human oversight, ensuring that professional judgment remained part of the enforcement process. The systems were designed to flag unusual circumstances for human review, while maintaining the consistent application of parking regulations that had been the hallmark of Dott's approach. The environmental movement of the 1980s and 1990s also found relevance in the parking meter rebellion, particularly as transportation policy became increasingly connected to environmental protection and urban sustainability. The principle that public policy should be applied consistently regardless of economic or political influence became crucial in debates about congestion pricing, emissions standards, and urban development policies. Environmental regulators facing pressure to modify air quality standards for major employers, or to provide exemptions from pollution controls for politically connected industries, drew inspiration from Kowalski's example. The rebellion had established that professional standards should supersede political convenience, a principle that proved essential for maintaining credibility in environmental enforcement. Dr. Patricia Williams, who served as regional administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency during the 1990s, spoke frequently about how the parking meter rebellion had influenced her approach to environmental enforcement. When powerful interests demanded special treatment or exemptions from environmental regulations, I remembered the parking enforcement officer in Millfield who refused to compromise her professional standards for a prominent businessman's convenience. That example gave me the courage to maintain scientific integrity despite intense political and economic pressure. The economic implications of the parking meter rebellion continued to evolve as urban development patterns changed and cities struggled with fiscal challenges during the 1980s recession. The rebellion had established that parking enforcement should be applied equally regardless of the violator's economic status. But it had also demonstrated that consistent enforcement could actually improve business conditions by creating predictable, fair regulatory environments. Studies conducted during the 1980s showed that downtown business districts with consistent parking enforcement actually experienced higher customer satisfaction and increased retail sales compared to areas where enforcement was irregular or influenced by political considerations. Customers appreciated knowing that parking spaces would be available because violations were consistently cited, regardless of who committed them. This finding contradicted the conventional wisdom that had motivated Harrison Blackwood's original demand for special treatment. Rather than harming business development, equal enforcement of parking regulations actually improved commercial conditions by ensuring that public resources were allocated fairly and efficiently. The rebellion's influence on municipal finance also became more apparent as cities faced increasing fiscal pressures during the 1980s and 1990s. Parking violation revenues represented significant income sources for many municipalities, and the consistent enforcement practices inspired by the Kowalski principles helped ensure that these revenues were collected fairly and efficiently. Cities that had adopted the Millfield model of parking enforcement typically reported higher collection rates for parking fines, reduced administrative costs for processing appeals, and decreased legal expenses from discrimination complaints. The economic benefits of equal treatment reinforced the moral and democratic arguments for consistent enforcement. The rebellion also influenced discussions about privatization of municipal services during the 1980s and 1990s. As cities considered contracting with private companies to handle parking enforcement, the Kowalski principles provided standards for evaluating whether privatization would maintain the equal treatment and professional integrity that had been established during the 1970s. Some privatization efforts failed because private contractors prioritized revenue generation over equal treatment, leading to enforcement practices that targeted low-income areas while ignoring violations in affluent districts. Cities that maintained public control over parking enforcement, guided by the principles established in Millfield, typically achieved better outcomes in terms of both revenue collection and community relations. The digital age brought new applications for the rebellion's principles. As cities implemented electronic parking systems, mobile payment apps, and dynamic pricing models that adjusted parking rates based on demand. The fundamental question remained the same. How could cities ensure that parking policies were applied fairly regardless of users' technological sophistication, economic resources, or political influence? The digital divide in parking enforcement became a new frontier for applying the Kowalski principles. Cities had to ensure that electronic payment systems didn't create barriers for users who lacked smartphones or credit cards, while also maintaining the consistent enforcement that had been the hallmark of DOT's approach. Modern parking enforcement officers dealing with app-based payment disputes, electric vehicle charging conflicts, or ride-sharing pickup zones could draw on the same principles that had guided Kowalski's decisions 50 years earlier. The specific technologies might be different, but the commitment to equal treatment and professional integrity remained constant. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2021 provided an unexpected test of the rebellion's enduring principles. As cities struggled with economic devastation and public health restrictions, parking enforcement became a flashpoint for debates about government authority, economic recovery, and social equity. Some cities suspended parking enforcement entirely during lockdowns, while others maintained normal operations. Cities that had internalized the Kowalski principles generally found more successful approaches that balanced public health concerns with the need for consistent, fair enforcement of modified regulations. The pandemic also highlighted how parking policy intersected with broader issues of social and economic justice. Essential workers who couldn't work from home often faced parking challenges that affluent residents could avoid, creating new applications for the equal treatment principles that had emerged from the 1971 rebellion. Contemporary parking enforcement officers dealing with pandemic-related disputes frequently cited Kowalski's example when explaining their commitment to fair enforcement, despite unprecedented circumstances. The rebellion had established a framework for maintaining professional integrity during crises that proved remarkably applicable to 21st century challenges. The Black Lives Matter movement of 2020 also drew connections to the parking meter rebellion, as activists highlighted how seemingly neutral law enforcement practices could have discriminatory effects. The principle of equal treatment that Kowalski had championed became part of broader discussions about ensuring that municipal services were truly equitable rather than merely formally neutral. Police reform advocates argued that the Kowalski principles, equal treatment, professional integrity, and resistance to political pressure, were essential for rebuilding trust between law enforcement and communities of color. The rebellion's emphasis on consistent application of standards, regardless of the subject's status, provided a model for reform efforts across various areas of public safety. The rebellion's influence on contemporary discussions about artificial intelligence and automated decision-making became apparent as cities implemented smart city technologies. The questions that had emerged from Dott's confrontation with Harrison, how to balance consistency with flexibility, how to maintain human judgment within systematic processes, became central to debates about algorithmic governance. AI researchers studying municipal service delivery frequently cited the parking meter rebellion as an example of how professional human judgment could be systematized without losing essential qualities of fairness and adaptability. The rebellion provided a historical foundation for thinking about how automated systems could embody the values of equal treatment and professional integrity. The ongoing relevance of the rebellion was formally recognized in 2021 when the National League of Cities established the annual Dorothy Kowalski Award for Excellence in Municipal Service, recognizing public employees who demonstrated exceptional commitment to equal treatment and professional integrity. The award ceremony, held each year in Millfield, attracts municipal leaders from across the country who continue to grapple with the same fundamental questions that had emerged from the 1971 confrontation. Recipients of the Kowalski Award have included parking enforcement officers, building inspectors, social workers, public health officials, and various other municipal employees who have maintained professional standards despite pressure from influential citizens or political leaders. Their stories demonstrate that the challenges Dot faced in 1971 continue to arise in new forms, and that her example continues to inspire contemporary public servants. The award ceremony always concludes with a reading of Dot Kowalski's original statement to the Millfield Committee. My job is to enforce parking ordinances fairly and consistently. If I start making exceptions for people based on their wealth, status, or political connections, then I'm not enforcing the law. I'm administering a system of privilege. Today, downtown Millfield has been transformed by decades of careful urban planning that balances historic preservation with modern development needs. The original parking meters from 1971 have been replaced by solar-powered electronic systems that accept mobile payments and provide real-time availability information. But the fundamental principles established during the rebellion continue to guide the city's approach to to municipal services. The Millfield Parking Authority, established in 1985, operates under a charter that explicitly incorporates the Kowalski principles into its mission statement. New employees receive training on the historical significance of equal treatment in parking enforcement, and the authority maintains a museum display about the 1971 rebellion that attracts visitors from around the world. Harrison Blackwood III passed away in 1998, but not before establishing a scholarship fund at the University of Wisconsin for students studying public administration and municipal governance. The fund's mission statement acknowledges his role in the parking meter rebellion and expresses hope that future public servants will learn from both the positive and negative examples provided by the 1971 incident. I learned the hard way that status and community contributions don't entitle anyone to special treatment under the law, Blackwood wrote in his 1995 autobiography. Kowalski taught me a lesson I should have learned much earlier, that democracy works best when everyone follows the same rules, regardless of their position in society. Kowalski continued working in parking enforcement until her retirement in 1989, eventually becoming supervisor of the department and training hundreds of other officers in the principles she had established. She passed away in 2003, but her influence on municipal governance continues through the countless public servants who have drawn inspiration from her example. The Kowalski Training Center, opened at the University of Wisconsin in 2005, offers continuing education programs for municipal employees across the Midwest. The center's curriculum emphasizes the connection between individual professional choices and broader democratic values, using the parking meter rebellion as a foundational case study. Students at the center learn that Dot's confrontation with Harrison Blackwood represented more than a dispute over a 25-cent parking violation. It was a defining moment in the ongoing struggle to maintain democratic equality in the face of economic inequality and political privilege. The 25 cents that started it all was eventually paid by Harrison Blackwood, along with a public apology to Kowalski for his inappropriate behavior during their confrontation. But the real value of that parking violation was not monetary. It was the reminder that democracy requires institutions and individuals willing to uphold equal treatment under the law, even when it would be easier to accommodate the preferences of the powerful. And perhaps that's the lesson we need to remember as we navigate our own encounters with civic authority and public service. That democracy is not a spectator sport, but a daily practice that requires all of us, whether we're parking enforcement officers or furniture store owners, students or retirees, to choose principle over privilege, equality over convenience, and the common good over personal advantage. The Great Parking Meter Rebellion of 1971 is over, but the questions it raised about fairness, authority, and equal treatment remain as relevant today as they were when Kowalski first refused to let Harrison Blackwood's status exempt him from the same rules that applied to everyone else. In our increasingly connected world, where individual actions can have far-reaching consequences, and where the temptation to seek special treatment seems stronger than ever, the example set on a Millfield Street corner 5 decades ago continues to remind us that integrity matters more than influence, and that the smallest acts of principled public service can help preserve the democratic ideals that make our communities worth defending. Whether you're feeding quarters into a parking meter today, or swiping your credit card at a sleek electronic kiosk, or tapping your smartphone to pay for street parking, remember that every transaction is part of a larger system built on principles of equal treatment and fair enforcement. The technology may have evolved beyond what Kowalski could have imagined in 1971, but the fundamental commitment to treating everyone the same under the law remains as essential today as it was when she first stood her ground against Harrison Blackwood's demands for special treatment. The parking spaces may be smarter now, but the people who govern them still face the same eternal choice between integrity and expediency, between principle and privilege, between serving the public good and accommodating private influence. In that choice lies the daily test of democratic character that determines whether our institutions will serve the many or the few, whether our communities will be governed by rules or by relationships, and whether the promise of equal justice under law will remain a living reality or fade into a forgotten ideal.